Welcome to the Sea Power Report. Today's topic, how the US Navy replenish at sea, also known as underway replenishment. Underway replenishment is the process by which warships and other naval vessels receive fuel, ammunitions, supplies, food, and other provisions while underway, which enables long-term and sustained operations without having to return to a friendly port. The US Navy mainly relies on two primary forms of underway replenishment methods. The first and the main method is connected replenishment, or alongside replenishment. The second is vertical replenishment using helicopters. There's also a third and far less common method of transferring supplies between ships, known as astern replenishment. This last method has become far less common over the past few decades, because the other two methods are just that much more effective. Well, today's video covers how the US Navy conducts underway replenishment. The same methods also apply to varying extents for the other major navies of the world, such as China's People's Liberation Army Navy, Britain's Royal Navy, the French Navy, and the Indian Navy as well. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The modern concept of underway replenishment evolved over the first half of the 20th century in response to the demands of modern naval warfare, especially during World War II and the development of the carrier-centric naval fleet. The initial conception of underway replenishment occurred during the interwar years, when the US Navy recognized that global reach required continuous operations at sea, especially in the Pacific, where port infrastructure was rather sparse, especially at the time. Starting around the early 1930s, the US Navy began testing methods for refueling at sea using hoses passed between ships traveling in parallel. These tests led to the development of side-by-side replenishment methods, what we now call connected replenishment. The Pacific theater of World War II was the crucial proving ground in which modern underway replenishment methods matured. The sheer distances involved in island-hopping campaigns and the continuous demand for aviation fuel, ammunition, and provisions for carrier task forces necessitated a robust at-sea logistic system. The Navy developed dedicated oilers, ammunition ships, and supply ships that would rendezvous with fleet units and conduct replenishments on the move. Notably, during the Leyte Gulf campaign of 1944, the Navy kept multiple carrier task forces supplied at sea through underway replenishment, enabling round-the-clock offensive operations without having to return to port. The ability to replenish at sea allowed the US Navy to maintain pressure on Japanese forces and shift from one theater to another without returning to base. Following World War II, the Navy institutionalized underway replenishment as a core capability. The 1950s and the early 1960s saw the invention and the gradual integration of key technology for connected replenishment, including things like cable ram tensioners and standardized probe and receiver systems for refueling. The Cold War emphasized global naval presence, and with the invention of nuclear-powered carriers and submarines, logistic ships became even more crucial for sustaining non-nuclear escorts at sea, and fully realizing the endurance potential of nuclear-powered capital ships. For a US Navy task force looking to resupply at sea in the present day, before any replenishment can actually happen, we need to have at hand a fleet replenishment ship. And the choice of the appropriate class of replenishment ship is not a one-size-fits-all decision. Rather, the choice of the logistic ship for the Naval Task Force will have to be a match between the logistic capability of that ship and the operational requirements of the task force. And this is influenced by factors like the type of mission, the tempo of the mission, the composition of the force, and the maritime geography. And of course, the intensity of the threat environment. Choosing the best replenishment ship for your mission and your naval force is very important. For supporting carrier strike groups during high-tempo missions or forward deployment, the thing you need is a fast combat support ship. These vessels are multi-product replenishment platforms. They can simultaneously deliver fuel, dry cargo, and ammunition in sufficient quantities within the same ship. 4 such ships are available to the US Navy, although 2 of them are held in reserve. This is the supply class. The supply class has a top speed of over 25 knots, which means that they can keep pace with aircraft carriers and surface combatants steaming at a high speed, enabling them to operate within an aircraft carrier group's escort screen. Obviously, by having substantial storage for all 3 main types of supplies, which are fuel, dry cargo, and ammunition, they combine the functions of oilers, dry cargo ships, and ammunition ships into one whole, which is convenient. However, the downside is that fast combat support ships are few in number, expensive to build and operate. So, their use is prioritized for critical missions and important naval forces, such as carrier strike groups. For slower tempo missions that rely primarily on fuel replenishment, especially for surface action groups or single ships on extended patrols, the fleet oiler is the most appropriate choice. I'm referring primarily to the Henry J Kaiser class of the United States. These are operated primarily by the Military Sealift Command and are crewed mainly by civilian crew members. The Henry J Kaiser class stores mainly marine and aviation fuel and deliver them mainly via connected replenishment. With a speed of only around 20 knots, they are not intended to sail with carrier groups at full speed, but are more designed for fleet support in lower tempo missions. While the fleet replenishment oiler, such as the Henry J Kaiser class, can deliver dry cargo and ammunition to a small extent, they cannot compete with dedicated dry cargo and ammunition ships, such as the US Navy's Lewis and Clark class, where the logistics requirements is weighted towards ordnances and dry goods, especially for forces such as amphibious ready groups. The dry cargo and ammunition ships is the most appropriate choice. In these situations, the Lewis and Clark class of the US Navy's Military Sealift Command is the first port of call. They are dry cargo and ammunition ships. They are well designed to sustain marine expeditionary units, for example, in amphibious landing missions, where sustained firepower and the continuation of ammunition supply are essential. Now that we covered the history and the development of underway replenishment in the US Navy, and covered the different types and classes of ships available for underway replenishment, we now move on to discuss the different methods for conducting resupply at sea. These are connected replenishments, which is the most common and the most efficient, vertical replenishments via helicopters, and lastly, astern replenishments for refueling. Generally speaking, all 3 types of fleet replenishment ships can use all 3 methods. Now let's get right into it. At its core, connected replenishment involves 2 or more naval vessels steaming in close formation, and most importantly, in parallel. typically between 30 to 50 meters apart, at speeds between 12 and 16 knots. The supplying ship, for example, a fast combat support ship, deliver fuel or dry cargo across tensioned lines or hoses to a receiving warship. This process demands skilled helmsmanship and close coordination and communication, as even very minor course deviation or disturbances from the weather can disrupt the whole operation, and even putting all the ships involved at risk. The procedure begins with the establishment of a physical connection between the two ships. A light messenger line is first passed from the supplying ship to the receiving warship. This is generally shot across using a line thrower across the water, which is usually a line gun. And the messenger line is used to haul across the heavier components of the transfer rig. For fuel transfer, this includes a span wire and one or more refueling hoses. For solid cargo, such as provisions and ammunition, a high line is hauled over and tensioned, using what we call a ram tensioner. This is a hydraulically operated system that maintains constant tension despite the pressure exerted by the cargo on the high line cable and the relative motion between the two ships. The ram tensioner continuously adjusts the length of the cable or the fuel hose to maintain constant tension regardless of the two ships' relative motion. Without the system, cables can go slack or even entangle with each other, or in the worst-case scenario, snap, posing danger to the crew and the ships, and of course compromising the transfer. The span wire, essentially a tensioned steel high line, forms the backbone of the cargo rig. A cargo trolley is attached to the span wire and moves across the wire to shift between the supplying ship and the receiving warship. The cargo trolley carries supplies and pallets, such as ammunition, provisions, or food. On the receiving warship, a receiving platform is used to safely lower the cargo, and it compensates for the rolling of the ship. This entire system of mechanisms allows for the safe transfer of heavy or even sensitive items in moderate sea conditions. Fuel hoses, on the other hand, are guided to the receiving warship's fueling stations using a probe and receiver system. Once the probe is securely locked into place, fuel pumps on the replenishment ship begin transferring marine fuel, or if appropriate, aviation fuel. While the connected replenishment method is unparalleled in terms of the speed and the efficiency of the supply transfer, it also comes with risk. The proximity of two large ships moving in close formation and in parallel creates the ever-present danger of collision, especially in higher sea states or in rougher sea conditions. The entire process is highly sensitive to changes in the weather and wind speed, and even moderate changes can force cancellation for the entire resupply operation. Throughout the entire process, precise communication between the two vessels is vital. A radio system is used to maintain contact from bridge to align course and speed of the two vessels. An essential element of the whole system that allows both vessels to respond flexibly to unforeseen emergencies is the Pelican hook, a robust, quick-release fitting used to secure or rapidly disconnect the supply lines. In emergency situations, where the two ships must immediately disengage and break away, for example, due to mechanical failure, threat detection, or sudden changes in the weather, the Pelican hook enables a controlled disconnection without damaging the equipment or endangering the personnel. Connected replenishment is the go-to method for the US Navy to transfer large volumes of supplies quickly and efficiently from the replenishment ship to the receiving warship. But it is also the most complex. It requires a high level of coordination, communication, and flexibility to respond to unforeseen situations, including in emergencies where the two ships must disengage quickly. Now let's talk about the second most common replenishment method in the US Navy, which is vertical replenishment. In essence, vertical replenishment involves the transfer of supplies from the supply ship to the receiving warship using helicopters, typically while both vessels are underway. In the US Navy, this operation is generally carried out by the MH-60S Nighthawk General Utility Medium Helicopter, with loads slung beneath the fuselage using a combination of cargo net and pallet. Supplies are lifted in this fashion from the deck of a supply vessel and delivered either to the flight deck or a designated vertical replenishment zone of a receiving warship, which may include aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, or amphibious warships. The main advantage of vertical replenishment is the flexibility. Unlike connected replenishment, vertical replenishment does not require ships to maneuver in close parallel formations. This permits resupply to take place over much greater distances, sometimes hundreds of meters apart. This reduces the risk associated with ships moving in close formation. It allows for multiple ships to be replenished in sequence or even concurrently to an extent, especially when the supply ship is able to operate multiple helicopters simultaneously. In a task force environment, a single logistic ship can service several warships at the same time, spread across a wide area. Perhaps the most significant advantage of vertical replenishment is that its effectiveness and feasibility is much less sensitive to the sea state and weather conditions. Because there's no need for side-by-side maneuvering or physical connection between the two ships, replenishment activity can continue in much rougher sea conditions that would otherwise suspend connected replenishments due to safety concerns. This key advantage enhances the fleet's ability to sustain resupply operations in less than ideal weather conditions, a critical factor in contested or remote maritime theaters. However, the disadvantage of vertical replenishment is also obvious. Vertical replenishment is inherently limited by the payload of the helicopter. It is much less efficient and far slower at moving a large volume of supplies as quickly as connected replenishment. It is only suitable for the transfer of dry cargo and ammunition. It is impractical for the high-volume transfer of fuel, whether that be aviation fuel or marine fuel. The use of helicopters obviously also demand maintenance facilities and dedicated pilots and flight deck crew to operate these, increasing the logistical footprint aboard both the supply ship and the receiving warship. So vertical replenishment has very obvious constraints. Now let's briefly talk about the last method, which is astern replenishment. Astern replenishment is where the receiving warship follows a supply ship, which trails a fuel hose from its stern, allowing the receiving warship to be refilled from that hose. The receiving warship picks up the hose from the water, which is attached to the supply ship, and engages the hose to its own fueling station, thereby allowing the transfer of marine fuel and, if appropriate, aviation fuel. Astern refueling can potentially allow a single replenishment ship to refuel up to 3 ships simultaneously using one hose each. However, generally speaking, astern replenishment does not allow the transfer of solid cargo and ammunition to occur. It is also much slower for refueling purposes compared with connected replenishment. In recent decades, astern replenishment has become far less frequent in the US Navy. It remains a viable method, but the other 2 methods are generally preferred. The astern replenishment method is constrained by a relatively low rate of fuel transfer and the inability to transfer dry cargo in general. It is less efficient, with a lower throughput and with less flexibility, making them less attractive compared to other methods for the US Navy over time. Underway replenishment is a foundational capability that enables the US Navy and the other major navies to project power on a sustained basis across the globe. By allowing warships and indeed entire carrier strike groups to refuel, rearm, and resupply without having to return to port, underway replenishment removes a logistical barrier that traditionally hinders naval power projection. Whether through connected replenishment that allows for high volume transfer of fuel, dry cargo, and ammunition, or vertical replenishment via helicopters for a more rapid and more flexible delivery across dispersed warships and across a wider range of weather conditions. Underway replenishment ensures that large naval formations can remain forward deployed, combat ready, and strategically unpredictable. In that respect, having a large fleet of replenishment ships that enables sustained underway replenishment for large naval forces is not merely a nice to have, it is a strategic enabler of global power projection. It is the real differentiator between green water navies that can only really project power inside one region of the world, from real blue water navies with true global reach.